We are back on the 0 Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. A lot of conversations going on around the country this week around, of course, the event, the Capitol riot, and the sequelae that have fallen out from that. And my next guest is, I always look forward to speaking with him, and he had an interesting piece on the media ecosystem and how that needs to change. So I always look forward to talking to him. Matt Taibbi is a columnist. He is a journalist. He's an author. His latest book, I believe, unless he slipped on past me, is Hate Incorporated, about the media. He has a podcast with Katie Halper, Useful Idiots. Is that the name?
That's right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And he joins us now. So, he has a new Substack too, taibbi.substack.com, which means I took my hand. It's Matt Taibbi. Matt, welcome back to the program.
All right. Thanks, Richard. Good to see you.
Always good to see you. So you wrote this piece on the idea that we need a new media system. And I was interested in it for a lot of reasons, Matt. One of which is that I think you and I, once again, are like kind of going through, like trying to hack our way through the same thicket of ideas and problems when it comes to journalism. And I really liked the take on this. I'm going to just read your conclusion, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I encourage people to go read the whole thing, of course. But you concluded, and this was interesting to me, what we've been watching for 4 years and what we saw explode last week is a paradox, a political and information system that profits from division and conflict and uses a factory-style process to stimulate it, but professes shock and horror when real conflict happens. It's time to admit this is a failed system. You can't sell hatred and seriously expect it to end. I mean, that to me, that's a heavy, you and I have long criticized some of our colleagues, but that's a pretty stern indictment, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a serious criticism, though. I mean, we work in a media ecosystem, and I know my personal feelings about this have changed pretty dramatically over the years. I've known for a long time that, basically most people in the media work for one side or another, and that a lot of our content is just producing stuff that we know our own audiences are going to like, and is designed to kind of get them upset about what those people over there are doing. Conversely, that the rival media ecosystem is doing the same thing. If you turned on Fox in the early 2000s, and every day you saw that they were doing some kind of a story on how the people who were, the liberal professors in your university, local university, were equivalent to Al-Qaeda terrorists, and that kind of language. Eventually, if you do it often enough, eventually people are going to start to believe it, and they're going to start to internalize real, tangible hatreds that will express themselves in real-world violence, and it will stop being a media exercise. And I think that's what happened in the Trump years. We've gotten to the place where basically both groups are describing each other as criminals, terrorists, white supremacists, whatever it is. It's not tenable any longer.
It's interesting. And to me, it's like, to the extent that I have any reputation at all, it's based on 15 or 16 or 17 years of basically saying, these are evil people doing evil things. The press sucks. And you shouldn't listen to them. And like many people, I think, just from a prose, let me back up a second. There are the institutional forces you describe encouraging this conflict and hate. But I would say for a lot of us as writers and commentators, our chops are, work the best fueling hate. I mean, I hate to admit it, but if I go back and reread my old stuff, a lot of which makes me cringe, in some ways, the best prose is talking about how horrible the other side is, I mean, and you're certainly known for that. And
totally. Yep.
And my feeling is, so there are institutional temptations, there are individual temptations, and it's like my whole thing feels like it might be, I don't want to say obsolete, but obsolete. So is that kind of what you're struggling with too?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I went through the same thought process because for a while, when I came back to the States in 2003, 2004, I started working for Rolling Stone around that time. And the first work that I did, was really kind of like Triumph the Insult Comic Dog type of stuff, where, mostly what I was doing is they would assign me some story about some Republican silliness, and I made my reputation picking on those people, and a lot of the time it was deserved. But I won the National Magazine Award in this country, the highest award you can get in the magazine business, for basically ripping on God, I'm blanking on his name. This is really embarrassing. The former governor of Arkansas, who's at Fox.
Not Pryor. He's a senator, but
no. You gotta edit this out. This is so bad. Mike.
Huckabee.
Mike Huckabee. My God.
Right,
all right.
right.
You got to. That was a senior moment. Yeah. So I basically I won the award basically ripping on Mike Huckabee as a buffoon and a guy who looked like a Muppet and all that stuff. And I'm not comparing that kind of material to the much more acerbic form of the genre, but certainly, we were operating within this ecosystem where there was a tremendous gravitational pull towards that kind of work, and whether you're working on the right or the left, you were very much encouraged to do the one thing, and anything that had like more nuance, it just didn't generate the clicks, so you weren't getting as much excitement from your editors, your bosses about that. The way out, was to do, the same kind of stuff about institutions. And I spent a lot of time between 2008 and 2016 writing about banks and bankers, which is a different thing than picking on Republicans. But basically the point holds is that we're all kind of operating in this intellectual combat space, which I think over time turns out to be irresponsible. That's what I worry anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in our defense, maybe, or in a pleading before the court, maybe in 2004. The system needed a little jolt or something, but I was thinking about the Bob Dylan line. I helped her out of a jam, I guess, but I used a little too much force. It's just like, what I mean? It's just like, I go back and I read that now. I think, and some of these people, I'm sure this has happened to you, but I've run into them. Mm-hmm. In New Hampshire primary 2016, they were doing the speed thing. I had done a thing on the Young Turks, a monologue, just like vicious to Mark Pryor, the senator from Arkansas. They sit him down as a, stand-in for Hillary or whatever, and somebody introduces us. It was one of the most awkward moments of my life, because, whatever my disagreements, he's a human being, so there are all these dimensions to it. On the other hand, because there's always an on the other hand, right, Matt? I still think about, for example, vice presidential debate 2012, Martha Raddatz setting up a question on Social Security with the preface, we all know it's going bankrupt. So there's that consensus. We're covering the Pete Peterson Fiscal Summit in 2014, 15, and everybody's getting paid to be there, right? Hosted Dana Bash and John Harwood. And all. So it's not as if the current system is working, but so you're really talking about not just a third way from, oh God, please, a third party from pro-democratic versus pro-republican, but to me, you're also talking about a different model of what objectivity might look like, because also in those, you talk about Hunter Thompson, objectivity itself became like, postmodernism started to run like a steamroller over the whole concept of journalistic objectivity. But there's got to be something like that, right? Even if it's
right.
So what do you think? I mean, you get what I'm driving at, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I talked about this in the piece. The kind of objective voice, journalistic objectivity that was standard in the business through probably the mid '80s. There were many ridiculous and lamentable elements about that kind of approach to journalism. It was not an ethical decision. It was a commercial decision. They were going for the widest possible audience. And the example I picked out, which was that Hunter Thompson in 1972, he was the only reporter whose spouse didn't have to ask, what is it really like in the campaign trail, because she read his articles. The fact that normal journalism didn't allow you to write with the kind of nuance and clarity that that he could, it spoke to a lot of tremendous weaknesses in the objective style, which also, by the way, covered up all sorts of implicit biases about militarism, about the privileges of wealth, about racism, whatever it was. It was burying the kind of bipartisan consensus. And one of the things that Noam Chomsky always talked about is that the people who rose within the traditional media system were the ones who were like the most adept at swallowing all those biases without having it upset their conscience too much, and being able to kind of continue working and producing material that fit the propaganda aims of whatever those companies were. So that's not like a model you want to go back to, as the old CBS, NBC, ABC model where everybody's saying the same thing and they're all saying that we got to go to war in Vietnam or whatever it is, right? Like, that's not what I'm talking about. But there was this thing with objectivity that was like aspirational, even if it wasn't effective. And that was this idea that individual people working within the system at least thought they had some kind of obligation to look at multiple sides of the issue before they went and did their reports. And also, they weren't actively trying to egg one audience against another. Like, that was also definitely a feature of the old media, which I think was more positive than negative. When they were being inflammatory, it was usually against some group outside the United States, which wasn't positive. But the new model definitely stresses intramural, internecine domestic conflict as the number one driver of sales, and that is really destructive.
Yeah, it's almost as if, and I think you allude to this here, but Matt Taibbi, but it's almost as if whatever your political point of view, you say it, actually. You say, how does our target demographic want to understand what's just unfolded? It starts from there, and then your target demographic for the media institution we're talking about becomes like the protagonist of this story, right? It's almost like a write your own adventure approach to journalism, where it's like, if I'm the New York Times and I'm addressing a prosperous, socially liberal readership, then it's going to be, this is what they want to do to you to prevent you from exercising certain individual freedoms. And if I'm MSNBC, this is how Putin and Trump are conspiring to block. And if I'm Fox, this is how the socialists are, And so you talk about the choice of words, the Trump protesters, as they're called on Fox News, the Atlantic calling them insurrectionists. And by the way, just parenthetically, I think they probably dig being called insurrectionists. I think they probably get off on it because it's got a certain cachet, you know. But yeah, this whole and then you say new companies now. I like this. And new companies now clean world events like whalers using every part of the animal. So it's like headlines as scrimshaw, you know, carved out. So, but the underlying point is, you know, our news media is and to a large extent, I would say, at least people like myself, I want to include you in it when I don't watch myself, are kind of replicating what we rightfully condemn Twitter for example, which is inflaming and you know, stoking conflict where there needn't necessarily be any.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole thing about the, you know, cleaning the whole animal. I mean, this is a thing that I'm really obsessed with, is this idea of taking news events and reporters just instantly commoditizing events. So just take any news story like the killing of Soleimani, right? So immediately when that happens, the liberal-leaning organizations like the New York Times, they draw up 15 or 16 different news stories that are all based on Trump's inappropriate reaction to that event, right? You know, his blundering handling of it, his taking credit for things that he probably shouldn't have taken credit for, blah, 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 right? So they immediately take things that are factually true, right? But they take the truths that they know are useful for their audience. Meanwhile, Fox takes the other part of the story, which is, you know, that the United States assassinated a dangerous, you know, Iranian, you know, general, and incidentally, they went after the press response that, you know, the Washington Post calling him a scholar and that sort of thing, right? So they take things that are factual and they send it to their audience. And I think what people don't get is that this happens with every single news story. Like, you know, the news companies just pour over all the facts and they all get used. You know, it's just that, you know, audiences only see one part of the story most of the time. Whereas, again, in the old system, which was very imperfect, you were more likely to see, you know, those different elements all represented in the same piece. Which made for like a less engaging, less exciting form of media, but it had a different impact on audiences.
Yeah, and we were closer to. I mean, there's always been yellow journalism. There's always been Hearst. There's always been, you know, whoever came before Hearst and after. But there was always something more like a consensus view of reality, right? And it was not. There were problems with that too, because if the consensus view being presented was artificial, then people were really deceived. But you know, it seems to, what I wonder about in this whole breakdown of that model, I mean, I think there are multiple forces at work, largely the ones you're describing, but I also wonder the extent to which our colleagues didn't address or prioritize the issues that were affecting people so severely in their daily lives. I wonder the extent to which that didn't also contribute to the breakdown. I turn on the news, it's 2011, everything's about the deficit, the budget deficit. Nobody's talking about the fact I haven't had a job since 2008. Nobody seems to give a rip, and my community's dying, and all the kids are on meth, or whatever it is in that particular community. I wonder to what extent there was a combination of financial forces and a kind of decay from within because the consensus view of what needed to be reported was off base.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true, right? And what you were talking about initially is, you know, the fact that there even was a consensus. I think going away from that model is the reason we don't have a commonly accepted set of facts now. It's impossible for Americans to argue with each other because they're not drawing from the same pool of information, and so they're talking past each other almost always. But yeah, absolutely, the inability of commercial media to focus on the stories that actually matter played a huge role in this. And I remember becoming conscious of this when I was covering presidential campaigns. I don't know how many weeks it was. I had been following the John Kerry campaign. I was on his plane. And I realized, wow, every city that I go to, I'm talking to the same people, and we're taking pictures of the same rich politicians in suits, and we're going to town after town after town, and these are people who have tremendous problems and joblessness, and we're not touching those problems. We're focusing on this soap opera story about a presidential campaign, which is we cover like a sports story. And it's distracting, and it's disconnecting from reality, and I think that contributes a lot to the kind of disconnect between the press and the rest of the country. We saw in 2016 how when Trump happened, so much of the media landscape just totally discounted the possibility that he could win, and that a huge part of that was that they hadn't sent their reporters out into the world to see where those emotions could possibly be coming from and what forces might be driving that. And so, yeah, both the mission and the approach have gotten off base.
And what's so interesting about that for me, Matt Taibbi, is that when you say something like that, or when any of us said something like that, there's enormous blowback from the left sometimes of, oh yeah, well I'm pretty sick of let's talk about Trump country and what Trump people think. And look, I get that you're sick of it, but if you want to know what's going to happen in your country, you need to explore all the areas and all the demographics. And I was on the other side of that in 2015, 2016, because I was a writer for Bernie. I had writer for Bernie Sanders. So we were like people are really going to resonate if we talk about the economic issues. But, a lot of times they didn't know we were doing it. 35,000 people show up in Portland, no coverage, no television coverage. 12,000 show up for Trump, 2 hours of live broadcast, because of they felt he was going to do something shocking and rude, and that would drive, just the power of the response to Bernie was not nearly as attractive from a broadcasting point of view as, the idea that a smaller audience, Trump might, make fun of a disabled person,
Oh, of course. Yeah. From a media perspective, Trump and Bernie are like polar opposites, right? I mean, in a way, they represented very similar stories because they both represented outsider challenges to an existing entrenched bureaucracy, from the two-party system, and they were both being successful. And I think one could argue they were both successful for some of the same reasons. Some of the same frustrations drove those voters. In some cases, there were very different frustrations. But Trump, as a media quantity, was perfect in 1,000 ways that Bernie isn't. Bernie is the polar opposite of what they want to show on television because his whole shtick is about making people think about the underlying taboo issues that we're trying to cover up. The ridiculous waste in the medical establishment, right. So these are things we can't show on television. So Bernie has no utility for the media except as a villain, maybe, of the left, a figure of fun, but he's not Trump in terms of driving clicks and ads.
My favorite moment working for Bernie was he was doing a town hall with Rachel Maddow, and she asked one of those questions he hates, rightfully, which was, what job would you want to have if you weren't a politician? And he said, president of CNN. Because you wouldn't see the crap on there. Which I thought was such a great answer. But
that's perfect, yeah.
I have to say that I agree with your analysis. I want to get to the solution in a second. And by the way, as much as I appreciated Hunter Thompson at the time, he's like E.E. Cummings. He just spawned so many horrible imitators. Right?
Well, you're looking at one of them. Yeah, exactly.
No. I'm not including all these people. Like, I don't care what you're high on. Just tell me what the hell happened. but in a way, like I've always described what I do as a kind of like activist journalism, right? But and maybe we've talked about this before, but I always want to get the facts right. I mean, that's like, I just can't stand not getting the facts right. But it seems to me that's like, and by the way, a lot of the great, really best stylists on our side of roughly on our side of the ledger politically, they don't seem to care anymore. I mean, a lot of these guys they've embraced like center left politics. I mean, I could name names if you want, but they've embraced center left politics. People love them for it. They snipe at Bernie, they snipe at whomever, but they're still great writers. I mean, their prose is great. They just the whole facts thing has kind of gotten behind them. So let's talk about in the time we got left, Matt, about what you could describe at one point as a new media channel, the press version of a third party where these financial pressures to maintain audience are absent. And I get that this is sort of like a first pass and might utopian in a sense, but you list, I think, 4 or 5 things, right? You say not be aligned with either Democrats or Republicans, employ a fairness doctrine, inspired approach, which I might have a couple questions about, but I get what you're saying. At least occasional explorations of alternative points of view. Embrace a utilitarian mission, stressing credibility over ratings, which is interesting. I mean, I start to think about.
Well, that gets to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, and operation on a distribution model that, as much as possible, doesn't depend on the indulgence of Apple, Google, Amazon, or Facebook, or anybody else for that matter, who have just shown us that if they don't like your politics, you will, become invisible.
Yeah.
Carnival of Souls, if you ever saw that great old horror movie,
Yep.
It's like, okay, you don't like our politics? Enjoy this, Nobody will even see you walk into the department store from now on. So let's talk about that for a second. Number one, since you are a guy who not only does reporting but expresses opinions, if this entity existed, right, would you join it or would you continue to express your opinions?
I might participate in some way, but I think what I do, I'm comfortable doing that. I'm used to it, and I'm kind of too old to change at this point. But I'd be intrigued at being involved in some level. I think a lot of the ingredients that would be necessary to build something like this is the institutional knowledge that you need to do it. Is vanishing because there are the journalists who were trained in a lot of these techniques that would be necessary, and the ethos that I'm thinking about, they're disappearing. I mean, as you say, there are people who've grown up in this ecosystem for so long that they're used to the idea that when they get something wrong, their audience forgives them because they're usually wrong about that other group. Right, and right. So if you're wrong in that direction, people they're okay with it because you're directionally correct, right? Whereas when I was coming up, and probably it's the same for you, most journalists talk about the terrible fear we all experience before publishing something, right? Where it's oh my God, am I going to get something wrong? And it stays with you your whole life. But I meet younger people now who don't have that, right? And is that a progress or not? I'm not sure, but
I don't think it is. I mean, See, this gets to me to the overarching question behind your bullet points, which is, well, first of all, I mean, it's like if I write, like if I had written, let's say, a great takedown of a hedge fund, or a hedge funder, but it was formed in 1984 and not 1982, and I don't find out till it's published, I'll be clinically depressed for 3 days. I mean,
right. Mm-hmm.
And that to me is partly not that I make mistakes, but if I did, I could imagine I would be clinically depressed. And to me, that's partially psychology, right? But the other thing behind your bullet points to me is you use the word ethos, and that was the word I was going to use. It's almost, I don't want to say spiritual thing, but it's a matter of Is that of value to you or not? Is getting it right, is uncovering the truth such a fundamental value that you will take, now Troy's going to have to bleep me, but shit from anybody you have to in order to tell this story because you believe so much in telling the truth. And I think there are a lot of great writers out there and journalists who just don't have that ethos and nowadays. And I think, I think there are those who do have it, but, to me, for this venture to succeed, it has to start with that. And then the rest almost becomes mechanical. I mean, the tough part to me is, reaching the audience. And maybe it's okay if it's only 15% of the news audience, if it's the right 15%, I don't know. But to me, it begins with, you know what? I care about the truth. I really care about the truth. You get what I'm saying, right?
I get what you're saying. And yeah, it absolutely is an ethos. And it's something we were all taught. It's a belief system in how the media is supposed to work. Like, we're basically taught that if you get it right, above all else, get it right.
Right.
And you give the audience the information, and then they will be better informed and they'll make the correct decision, and things will just sort of work out better from there, right? But the onus on, like, our only job in that tableau is to focus on accuracy and transmitting information correctly, because that's a hard enough job, actually. And none of us are rocket scientists. If you're in the media, you've probably flunked out of some other thing that's harder, right? So focus on that, and society will function better. The new model of how the media works is you pick the correct political path and you propagandize it, because that is the faster way to help society get to the better place. But I think that's actually not true, or at least I think it's questionable whether that's true. And so the main thing with this new venture would be to base it on that other interpretation of how the press worked, which is also stress the independence of the media institutionally as being of critical importance to how they do their jobs. So CBS, ABC, and NBC, they tried really hard to not look like they were overtly on one side or another, in terms of what party they supported, because that gave them more power, right? Like, that's where their power came from, is from the perception of their independence. And that's been lost in this. So I think those two things go hand in hand, this idea of, like, being independent and then focusing on the task as opposed to having a political aim, if that makes sense.
It does. And I also think that whatever political aim you may have should be just that people make decisions that are as informed as possible. And that is a noble political aim. And, look, it's going to be decades, I think, before Fox and MSNBC and all those things go away. But has anybody, this is a relatively, I think this piece just came out, but yesterday, maybe as we're talking now, but has anybody gotten back to you on it?
Well, I mean, there are people talking about this idea behind the scenes, and I'm not the first one to have it. I mean, I think there are a lot of discussions about alternative media ventures that could happen, and we've seen in the last couple of years a number of innovations. Substack is one, Patreon is another. I think the show, the Hill Rising show, was an interesting attempt to try to bust through the kind of TV partisan format. So there's been a lot of experimentation on that score, but this moment in time now is, I think, is going to accelerate, movement in that direction, because it's now so stark that there's only these two brands, and that something else is needed.
There's a Norwegian Institute of Conflict Resolution. I'm thinking of just flying over there and studying there for 6 months to get ready for the next phase Journalism. Well, Matt, are you going to stay, before I let you go, are you going to stay on this topic, or is this kind of all you have to say on it?
Yeah. No, I think this is a crucial topic. I'm very interested. You know, I wrote a book on this subject, and this business means a lot to me. And you know, it's been really depressing in a lot of ways to see a lot of the things that have happened, especially in the last 10 years or so. So yeah, absolutely. I know you feel the same way. So.
I definitely do. And you have to step away from certain endorphin hits that you might get, you know, from like slamming, you know, before you check your facts or whatever. But so I applaud you for that, because I know that feeling. It's one day at a time. But so Matt Taibbi, his Substack is taibbi.substack.com. His latest book is Hate Incorporated. His podcast with Katie Halper is Useful Idiots. Thanks for writing this piece, and it's always great talking with you.
Thanks so much, Rich. Take care.
You too. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.